to dealing with our long-term spending problems. The president just won't do it without raising taxes, and so not much really to talk about. No.
On the issue of
Are we in a quorum call?
We are in a quorum call.
I would ask that it be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I rise to talk about the business on the floor, which is the omnibus appropriation bill. So let me start by thanking Chairwoman Mikulski for her leadership. She's put long hours in this over the Christmas and New Year's break, where most people were home with families and doing things in their home state and on vacation. She never stopped working, and her team, her staff on the Appropriations Committee never stopped working, and the staff, as always, is kind of the unsung hero around here, and they did so many great things to put this together. Both Democrats, Republicans, House and Senate, everybody had to work together to get this done, and I'm proud that they did. I'm also proud to be one of the Appropriations Subcommittee chairs that was able to work on this legislation. And as you know, I'm chairman of the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee, and I've worked with my counterpart, Senator Blunt, the ranking member of the subcommittee, to craft part of this bipartisan bill. And again, Senator Blunt has been really wonderful to work with. We appreciate him and his staff as well. When people hear agriculture appropriations, they often think about farming, and that's understandable. We all understand why, and that's certainly a key part of the bill, but that's not all that it does. Our bill helps farmers with operating loans, conservation practices, marketing. It funds programs that benefit rural communities like clean drinking water and rural housing. It supports nutrition programs that help kids across the country. And it also funds international food assistance like Food for Peace that allows crops grown here at home to be distributed around the world. This bill, in addition, touches on the Food and Drug Administration, and that is an agency that is vitally important to the U.S. And here again, just like agriculture is one of the core strengths of the U.S. economy, pharmaceuticals is another area where America leads the world, and it's critically important that we have a highly functioning FDA in order for us to keep that competitive advantage. So this bill overall has a huge impact on the U.S. economy, but my subcommittee's part of the bill also has a very significant bearing on the U.S. economy that will continue this recovery, get people back to work, get people focused on domestic jobs, and the fact that we make things here and grow things here is critically important for our future. Just look, for example, at what it's doing at my home state. And if I could go around to each one of these desks in the Senate and talk about specific things it's doing in every one state. But just in my home state, it's providing funding for many of our universities, including the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, to conduct cutting-edge agricultural research. It's supporting economic development grants for the Delta Regional Authority, which is in our region of the country, to boost quality of life in the Delta region. It's providing our kids with a safe and stable food supply by supporting, again, in our state, it's the Arkansas Children's Nutrition Center in Little Rock, and it's investing in technology of tomorrow by funding the National Center for Toxicological Research in Jefferson County, Arkansas. The NCTR, which is part of the FDA, is something that's also very important, and people often take for granted. They don't understand what it does, but it is very important. And now they have a new focus on nanotechnology, which they've been doing the last few years, and that's going to be a game changer as well. And those are just a few of the things it's doing. I could stand here for an hour or so explaining all the benefits of the bill, and I could talk about all the provisions and lots of different things about that are contained in this bill. But I think overall the most important thing to note here about the Ag-Approps bill and the Omnibus bill overall is that this was an agreement reached because of bipartisanship. And we have to look back at what Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan did. Appreciate both of them. They laid the groundwork for us to be here today. That was a bipartisan effort. Went through both houses, bipartisan, big votes. And like today, we saw a huge vote in the U.S. House of Representatives yesterday. I hope we're going to see a large vote here in the Senate today or tomorrow or Saturday, whenever we get this done. Certainly, I hope it's going to be today. But nonetheless, this is a victory for bipartisanship, and the ag-approps part of that is important. But the overall thing, the fact that the Congress is back in business, that we're getting things done. We're getting back to what our chairwoman calls regular order, that we're working together, and that's the only way we can get things done in Washington, but it's also the only way we can secure our nation's economic future. And I hope we'll see a lot more bipartisanship in 2014. I know it's an election year. All the talking heads tell us that's going to be hard to do, but certainly I hope we can get that done. 2014, I hope it's a much more productive year in the Congress than 2013 was. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Mr. President,
The senator from Maryland.
again, I rise to compliment a subcommittee chairman. The senator from Arkansas took over this committee the first time this year, so he's a new chairman, though he's not new to the issues. I'd like to thank you for the work that you did and the bipartisan tone that you set. Again, you've done an excellent job, I believe, working with the senator from Missouri, Senator Blunt. And what was impressive was how you took, really, when we say agriculture, Mr. President, that's one word, but agriculture in this country is very diverse. So am I right that you handled everything from artichokes to catfish? What do you handle in your bill?
And we handle, as you said, everything from artichokes, catfish, everything in between. In our bill, we take the entire Department of Agriculture, with the exception of forestry. Forestry goes to another subcommittee, and we also do FDA. And really, if you look at, for example, I mentioned agriculture is one of the core strengths in the U.S. economy. It may not be very exciting to some people. We may take it for granted here because in this country we've always had productive agriculture. But if you look at the advantages that gives us as a nation in lots of different ways, we need to keep that core strength going, just like with the pharmaceuticals, and the Food and Drug Administration is critically important as well.
Well, I want to thank you also, Senator, for what you and the gentleman from Missouri, Senator Blunt, did in terms of food safety. I believe when we did the continuing resolution, and also when we were facing shutdown, food safety really faced our inspectors. We both share in our state chicken. You know, chicken is a $2 billion industry over on the Eastern Shore. A lot of good people have good jobs because of good chicken. But without those inspectors, my poultry industry would have really been halted. What were the consequences of that in those days, and what have we done in this bill?
That's exactly right. Had we not had those food inspectors, it literally could have shut down poultry plants, but also beef and pork and other type of facilities overnight, and it could have shut them down and been very disruptive. One of the great things about agriculture in the U.S. is we've created a lot of efficiencies in the agriculture economy. And so when you have something disruptive like these inspectors can't inspect the meat and they just can't operate, you start to cause all kinds of disruptions, all kinds of inefficiencies. And then what happens is the price of that chicken fillet at the grocery store goes up. When you go to a restaurant, it goes up. And we do not need to jeopardize our food supply either on food safety grounds or on supply grounds, because we have, if you look at the U.S. and what we spend as a per capita share of our income per capita, we spend less on food than anybody in the world. And I know it's in relative terms because I have to use that in per capita because we have a higher standard of living here, but we do. And it's something that we're very fortunate about, and because of this legislation and because of what Senator Stabenow and others are doing with the Farm Bill, I mean, it's all a team effort here. We're going to keep that advantage and keep that food and fiber cheap and also create those are all domestic jobs. That's something very important. This is grown here, it's raised here, it's processed here, and it's served here. And it's great for domestic jobs. It has a huge ripple effect in the U.S. economy. So this bill is part of that, and I'm just proud to, have a hand in it.
Well, Mr. President, the senator from Arkansas, as well as his ranking member, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Blunt, have done a great job. Sometimes Congress gets the rap that we grow the deficit, but here in that agriculture subcommittee, they really grew jobs. And they grew it by making sure we had a solid approach to agriculture itself, where farmers and producers and distributors were able to do their job, and the work of the FDA through food safety really has not only kept America safe, but it enabled those who produce food in our country to have the right inspection so they can have the right confidence to go right out to the supermarket. So we're very proud of what they did. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
And Mr. President, I would say in conclusion that as I look on the floor, I see a senator from Alabama, from Maryland, from Maine, from Connecticut. Agriculture touches each of these states. May touch them differently. Some states may focus on one thing and other states another, but nonetheless, agriculture is truly a matter of national pride. Every state contributes. Basically, every person benefits from it. So, again, I was honored to be part of this, and the chairwoman deserves a lot of credit for pushing this through and working in a bipartisan way and getting it done through both houses. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm pleased and proud to follow my colleague from Arkansas and join him in his applauding the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski, for her extraordinary and historic work on this measure, which serves so well our values and goals and our traditions in the Senate of bipartisan service and putting America first over partisanship. And I want to join my very distinguished colleague from Arkansas, who has highlighted so well the values served by agriculture in America and served well by this appropriations bill and by the measure that Chairwoman Stabenow is seeking to forge, again, through bipartisan work involving both houses of this body. Agriculture serves so many of our basic values in this nation, environmental and consumer values, patriotism and pride in a way of life. And in Connecticut, we know deeply and urgently how threatened these values and traditions and way of life are, and the environmental and consumer issues at stake. I'm pleased that we are near a compromise, on the verge and the cusp of an agreement in the Farm Bill that will serve the interests of farmers in Connecticut and around the country, most especially the dozens of dairy farmers with relatively small farms around Connecticut who have said to me again and again and again, we need help and we need certainty. That is the message that they've given me as I visited their farms around the state of Connecticut time and again. And now, apparently, help and certainty are on the way. I'm pleased that the Farm Bill conferees have reached a compromise on the dairy provisions in the Farm Bill. We are going to be studying them very, very closely. They've only just been announced. Apparently, the New Deal announced by the Farm Bill conferees would keep the margin insurance program but remove the dairy market stabilization program. And in place of that dairy market stabilization program, the deal revives a recently expired milk income loss coverage plan, known as the Milk Plan, Milk Income Loss Coverage Plan, as a transitional program while the new marginal insurance plan is being set up by the United States Department of Agriculture. Without going into all of the details here, I think this agreement represents progress, and I'm going to carefully scrutinize it and seek to improve it from the standpoint of Connecticut's dairy farmers. But there can be no doubt, none whatsoever, to anyone in this body, I think we'd all agree, as to the importance of the milk industry, beginning with the dairy farmers. Indeed, reflecting the importance of milk to America is the fact that it is the only beverage, other than water, that is permitted on the floor of the United States Senate, so far as I know. I think I'm correct. And so I'm pleased and proud to have today some milk on the floor, the first in my young experience as a United States Senator, and I'm not sure that it is a correct parliamentary inquiry, Mr. President, but got milk? I'm willing to share. This issue is a very serious one because the lives and livelihoods of our farmers are at stake. The open space that may be sacrificed if dairy farms surrender and are forced to abandon this way of life by the increasingly high costs of feed, fuel, labor that are pressing them as they also encounter potential price diminishing and reductions. And so they are squeezed. Dairy farmers are squeezed. And in Connecticut, we have small family-owned farms like the Fairview Farms in Woodstock, Hightone Farm in Coventry, Maple Leaf Farm in Hebron, Fort Hill Farms in Thompson, Cushman Farms in Franklin, and Graywall Farms in Lebanon. I visited a number of them. I know firsthand how hard these farmers work simply to keep their farms going. These 6 farms make up the Farmer's Cow, a group of Connecticut family-owned farms dedicated to producing some of the very best milk in America. Their milk is so good, in fact, they opened a milk bar. That's right, a milk bar in Mansfield called the Farmer's Cow Cafe and Creamery. You can choose from 5 or 6 different types and flavors of milk to help wash down their delicious and fresh sandwiches, salads, cheeses, and ice cream. Visit Connecticut and visit the Farmer's Cow Cafe. These are the farms we need to support and keep going. These are the hardworking men and women we need to support. We can and must support our dairy farmers in Connecticut and around the country. In Connecticut, in fact, we have more than 150 dairy farms on 70,000 acres, 18% of our state's land, which translate into $2 billion in economic activity for the state of Connecticut alone. These farmers need help, they need stability, and they need certainty. Unfortunately, some in the House of Representatives had delayed the Farm Bill for far too long, leading dairy producers to wonder whether the federal government is a friend or a foe to their businesses. And even though Connecticut's dairy industry is a significant contributor to the state's agricultural industry and general economy, the industry's strength and survival depend on support that the federal government can and must provide. According to the Connecticut Farm Bureau, that is a fact of life, and they are supporting efforts by our delegation to provide that support. In Connecticut, in 1975, there were 817 dairy farms. Today, there are 150. I think that experience probably is reflected by every state represented in this body. Every one of my colleagues perhaps can attest to the diminishing number of dairy farmers and farmers in general. But Connecticut is doing its part and doing its share so that the farms in our state are sustained, and the federal government ought to do its part as well. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, Connecticut ranks 45 out of 50 states in receiving agriculture-related subsidies. Connecticut received $127 million between 1995 and 2010, compared to the $22 billion received by Iowa and the $24 billion that went to Texas. Nothing against those states, not criticizing those amounts, but the amount that we receive in Connecticut is a fraction, a small fraction of what is needed to sustain our dairy farmers, and that's why I will be urging and advocating for dairy farmers in Connecticut under this deal. Their interests are shared nationwide. We need to make sure that the agreement announced yesterday by the Farm Bill conferees, keeping the margin insurance program but removing the dairy market stabilization program and reviving the milk program, truly serves milk producers in our nation. Not just the processors, but consumers and farmers. We must do right by America's dairy farmers, as often an often underrepresented group in this body, and make sure that we do right by our farmers and consumers by giving them the certainty and help they need to continue a way of life and a product that is vital to our health and our well-being as a nation. I thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Will the gentleman from Connecticut yield for a question?
I'd be pleased to yield for a question.
First, let me thank you for your generous words about the work of this committee, but is that what's in your glass? I'm drinking water. What is on your desk?
I have milk, Madam Chairman, and I offered the President, the presiding officer, to share with him, and I will personally, after we are done here, I know that Maine has its share of farmers. He is not allowed under our Senate rules to respond in substance, but I'd be glad to share with you, Madam Chairman.
If I say to the gentleman from Connecticut, I've been in the Senate 25 years. I've seen a lot of senators try to put a lot of things in those glasses. I've never seen milk on the Senate floor. Is that a permissible use?
I am told, Madam Chairwoman, that it is a permissible beverage on the floor of the Senate. If not, I am sure that I will be subject to appropriate disciplinary action.
I think it's wonderful. For all of us who just yearn for a calcium-rich diet to see that. But actually, we salute Connecticut and its strong agricultural presence in our economy, and for the senator bringing a nutritious beverage to the Senate floor that's allowed under the rules, and if it's not, I'm sure we could have the appropriate committees of jurisdiction to do it. But most of all, I think what the senator is saying is we have a lot of people in our country that work in agriculture, and agriculture is not one field. The agriculture of the United States of America is diverse, and we can't let these small farmers fade away, or new emerging farmers that I'm seeing in my own state, whether it's in dairy or growing beef and so on, and with the whole so-called farm-to-fork movement, that it could be the dawn of a new age in agriculture while we preserve that which has been traditional and fed America during good times and bad. So I thank the gentleman for his work and his advocacy and look forward to working with him.
I thank the chairwoman for those remarks, and to say to her, as I do to all of my colleagues, that agriculture and farming really are a way of life. We need to make sure that our family farms and all farms are sustained. We tend sometimes to neglect or take them for granted, and I really want to, again, thank the distinguished senator from Maryland to the time and attention that she has devoted over the many years that she's been here to the farms of Maryland and the farms of America. And I think it is a cause that we share, whether it's Alabama or Georgia or any other state that's represented on the floor here today, or Maine. We need to make sure that we provide the safety net where it's necessary and the support when it's due, but also keep in mind that consumers ultimately are the beneficiary. The men and women and children, having 4 children myself and having for a time actually worked on a farm, I know that this product is central really to the American existence and the American way of life. So I thank the chairwoman and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
I ask a unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
I note that at this time, can I have the schedule? At approximately 12:30, I note that the gentleman from Arizona is on the floor. I just inquired the gentleman, he had from 12:30 he was going to speak on the War Powers Act. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I was awaiting the arrival of my colleague from Virginia who was going to speak first. And
well, I just say to the gentleman from Arizona, I think this is an important discussion. We will do it any way you and the gentleman from Virginia wish. If we wait for an absence of a quorum till he comes, fine. But if the gentleman wishes to proceed, that would be fine with this side of the aisle. Whatever way the gentleman from Arizona would like to proceed on this important topic.
I thank you, Madam Chairman. I will hope that the chair will chastise the senator from Virginia for being tardy, and I know that the chair was very capable of that. So I will go ahead and begin as I had planned on the senator from Virginia being first. He's the sponsor of the bill of which I'm a co-sponsor. I thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm pleased today to join my colleague, the junior senator from Virginia, as we introduce today the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014. This legislation is the final product of the National War Powers Commission, which was a bipartisan effort co-led by former Secretary of State Jim Baker and former Secretary of State Warren Christopher. The commission was set up by the Miller Center at the University of Virginia to devise a modern and workable war powers consultation mechanism for the executive and legislative branches. It included some of our nation's most distinguished and respected thinkers and practitioners of national security policy and law. In 2008, after more than a year of hard work, the Commission released the final product, an actual legislative proposal to repeal and replace the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which no American president has ever accepted as constitutional. Like my colleague, I view our introduction of this legislation today as the start of an important congressional and national debate, not the final word in that debate. We want to pick up where the National War Powers Commission left off 6 years ago, and we do so fully understanding and hopeful that this legislation should be considered and debated and amended and improved through regular order. My colleague from Virginia has done a great job on this legislation, and I'm proud to join him. I'd like to expand a bit why updating the War Powers Resolution is such a worthwhile endeavor for the Senate to consider right now. My friends, the Constitution gives the power to declare war to the Congress, but Congress has not formally declared war since June of 1942. Even though our nation has been involved in dozens of military actions of one scale or another since that time. There is reason for this. The nature of war is changing. It's increasingly unlikely that the combat operations that our nation will be involved in will resemble those of World War II, where the standing armies and navies of nation-states squared off against those of rival nation-states on clearly defined fields of battle. Rather, the conflicts in which increasingly we find ourselves and for which we must prepare will be murkier, harder to reconcile with the traditional notions of warfare. They may be more limited in their objectives, their scope, and their duration, and they likely will not conclude with a formal surrender ceremony on the deck of a battleship. The challenge for all of us serving in Congress is this: how do we reconcile the changing nature of war with Congress's proper role in the declaration of war? It's not exactly a new question, but it is a profound one. For unless we in Congress are prepared to cede our constitutional authority over matters of war to the executive, we need a more workable arrangement for consultation and decision-making between the executive and legislative branches. We have seen several manifestations of this challenge in recent years. In 2011, President Obama committed U.S. military forces to combat operations in Libya to protect civilian populations from imminent slaughter by a brutal anti-American tyrant. I, for one, believe he was right to do so. But 6 months later, when our armed services were still involved in kinetic actions in Libya, not just supporting our NATO allies, but conducting air-to-ground operations and targeted strikes from armed, unmanned aerial vehicles, the administration claimed, as other administrations would, that it had no obligations to Congress under the War Powers Act because our armed forces were not involved in combat operations. That struck many members of Congress, including me, as fundamentally at odds with reality. And unfortunately, it pushed more members of Congress into opposition against the mission itself. More recently, we saw the opposite problem manifested with regard to Syria. Perhaps due to the backlash in Congress that the administration's handling of the Libya conflict engendered, President Obama decided to seek congressional authorization for limited airstrikes against the Assad regime after it slaughtered more than 1,400 of its own citizens with chemical weapons last August, an operation that likely would have lasted a few days and thus been fully consistent with the President's authority under the existing War Powers Resolution had he decided to act decisively and take limited military action. Instead devolved into a stinging legislative repudiation of executive action. The tragic result was that the Assad regime was spared any meaningful consequences for its use of a weapon of mass destruction against innocent men, women, and children, and like Libya, the forces that want to turn America away the world were not checked but empowered. Now, some of us may see the problem in these two instances as a failure of presidential leadership, and I would agree. But I also believe that the examples of Libya and Syria represent the broader problem we as a nation face. What is the proper war power authority of the executive and legislative branches when it comes to limited conflicts, which are increasingly the kinds of conflicts with which we are faced? It is essential for the Congress and the President to work together to define a new war powers consultative agreement that reflects the nature of conflict in the 21st century and is in line with our Constitution. Our nation does not have 535 commanders-in-chief. We have one, the President. And that role, as established by our Constitution, must be respected. Our nation is poorly served when members of Congress try to micromanage the Commander-in-Chief in matters of war. At the same time, now more than ever, we need to create a broader and more durable national consensus on foreign policy and national security, especially when it comes to matters of war and armed conflict. We need to find ways to make internationalist policies more politically sustainable. After the September 11th attack, we embarked on an expansive foreign policy. Spending on defense and foreign assistance went up, and energy shifted to the executive. Now things are changing. Americans want to pull back from the world. Our foreign assistance and defense budgets are declining. The desire to curb presidential power across the board is growing. and the political momentum is shifting toward the Congress. America has gone through this kind of political rebalancing before, and much of the time we've gotten it wrong. That's how we got isolationism and disarmament after World War I. That's how we got a hollow army after Vietnam. And that's how we weakened our national security after the Cold War, in the misplaced hope of cashing in on a peace dividend. We can't afford to repeat these mistakes. A new war powers resolution, one that is recognized as both constitutional and workable in practice, can be an important contribution to this effort. It can more effectively invest in the Congress the critical decisions that impact our national security. It can help build a more durable consensus in favor of the kinds of policies we need to sustain our global leadership and protect our nation. In short, the legislation we are introducing today can restore a better balance to the way national security decision-making should work in a great democracy such as ours. Let me say again, neither the senator from Virginia nor I believe the legislation we are introducing today answers all of the monumental and difficult questions surrounding the issue of war powers. We believe this is a matter of transcendent importance to our nation, and we as the deliberative body of our government should debate this issue. And we look forward to that debate. This legislation should be seen as a way of starting that discussion both here in the Congress and across our nation. We owe that to ourselves and our constituents. And most of all, we owe that to the brave men and women who serve our nation in uniform and are called to risk their lives in harm's way for the sake of our nation's national defense. Mr. President, before I ask my tardy colleague from Virginia, I would like to mention again that another reason why I think that this legislation should be the beginning of a serious debate which should lead to some conclusion. The fact is that no President of the United States has recognized the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. That is a problem in itself. That is a perversion, frankly, of the Constitution of the United States of America. That's one reason. But the most important reason, Mr. President, I believe that we are living in incredibly dangerous times. When you look across the Middle East, when you look at Asia and the rise in the tensions in that part of the world, and you look at the conflicts that are becoming regional, and whose fault they are is subject for another debate and discussion. But the fact is we are in the path of some kind of conflict which, whether the United States of America wants to or not, we may have to be involved in some ways. We still have vital national security interests in the Middle East. It is evolving into a chaotic situation, and you can look from the Mediterranean all the way to the Straits of Hormuz, the Gulf of Aqaba, and throughout the region. And so I believe that the likelihood of us being involved in some way or another in some conflict is greater than it's been since the end of the Cold War. And I believe the American people deserve legislation and a clear definition of the responsibilities of the Congress of the United States and that of the President of the United States. And I again want to thank my colleague from Virginia, whose idea this is, who took a great proposal that was developed at the University of Virginia and was kind enough to involve me in this effort. And I thank him for it, and I thank him for his very hard work on it, despite the fact that the chair will recognize that he was late for this discussion.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague from Arizona for pointing to all in the chambers my tardiness, and I should not have been tardy because I do not like to follow the senator from Arizona. I would rather begin before him. But I want to thank him for his work together on this important issue and amplify on a few of the comments that he's made. Today, together as co-sponsors, we're introducing the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014, which would repeal the 1973 War Powers Resolution and replace it. I could not have a better co-sponsor than Senator McCain and appreciate all the work that he and his staff have done over the last months with us. I gave a floor speech about this issue in this chamber in July of 2013, almost to the day, 40 years after the Senate passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And many of you remember the context of that passage. When it was passed in the summer of 1973, it was in the midst of the end of the Vietnam War. President Nixon had expanded the Vietnam War into Cambodia and Laos without explicit congressional approval. And the Congress reacted very negatively and passed this act to try to curtail executive powers in terms of the initiation of military hostilities. It was a very controversial bill. When it was passed, President Nixon vetoed it. Congress overrode the veto at the end of 1973, but as Senator McCain indicated, no president has conceded the constitutionality of the 1973 Act, and most constitutional scholars who've written about the question have found at least a few what they believe would be fatal infirmities in that 1973 resolution. It was a hyper-partisan time, maybe not unlike some aspects of the present, and in trying to find that right balance in this critical question of when the nation goes to war or initiates military action, Congress and the President did not reach an accord. I came to the Senate, Mr. President, with a number of passions and things I hoped to do, but I think I only came with one obsession, and this is that obsession. Virginia is a state that's most connected to the military of any state in the country. Our map is a map of American military history, from Yorktown, where the Revolutionary War ended, to Appomattox, where the Civil War ended, to the Pentagon, where 9/11 happened. That is who we are. 1 in 9 Virginians is a veteran. If you add to our population our active duty, our Guard, Reserve, our military families, our DOD civilians, our DOD contractors, you're basically talking about 1 in 3 Virginians. These issues of war and peace matter so deeply to us as they do to all Americans. The particular passion that I had in coming to this body around war powers was kind of a disturbing thought, which is, if the President and Congress do not work together and find consensus in matters around war, we might be asking our men and women to fight and potentially give their lives without a clear political consensus and agreement behind the mission. I do not think there's anything more important than the Senate and Congress can do than to be on the board on decisions about whether or not we initiate military action. Because if we don't, we are asking young men and women to fight and potentially give their lives with us not having done the hard work of creating the political consensus to support them. And so that is why I have worked hard to bring this to the attention of this body and with Senator McCain. The Constitution actually sets up a fairly clear framework. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, not 535 Commanders-in-Chief, as Senator McCain indicated, but Congress is the body that has the power both to declare war and then to fund military action. And in dividing the responsibilities in this way, the framers were pretty clear. James Madison, who worked on the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson and said, quote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It is accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Despite that original constitutional understanding, our history has not matched the notion that Congress would always be the initiator of military action. Congress has only declared war 5 times in the history of the United States, while presidents have initiated military action prior to any congressional approval more than 120 times. Now, in some of these instances where the President has initiated war, Congress has come back and either subsequently ratified presidential action, sometimes by a formal approval or sometimes by informal approval, such as budgetary allocation. But in other instances, including recently, presidents have acted and committed American military forces to military action without any congressional approval. And the senator from Arizona mentioned the most recent one. President Obama committed military force to NATO, action against Libya in 2011, without any congressional approval, and he was formally censured by the House of Representatives for doing so. The current context that requires a reanalysis of this thorny question after 40 years of the War Powers Resolution was well stated by the senator from Arizona. Wars are different. They start differently. They're not necessarily nation-state against nation-state. They could be limited in time, or as of now, we are still pursuing a military force that was authorized on September 18, 2001, 12 or 13 years later. Wars are of different duration, different scope, different geography. Nation-states are no longer the only entities that are engaged in war. And these new developments that are challenging, what do we do about drones in countries far afield from where battles were originally waged, raises the issue of the need to go back into this War Powers Resolution and update it for the current times. As the senator from Arizona mentioned, this has been a question that members of Congress have grappled with and thought about, as have diplomats and scholars and administration officials and members of Congress for some time. In 2007, the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency at the University of Virginia convened a National War Powers Commission under the chairmanship of two estimable and bipartisan leaders, former Secretaries of State Warren Christopher and James Baker. And the remaining members of the commission were a complete A-list of thinkers in this area: Slate Gordon, Ab Mikva, Ed Meese, Lee Hamilton. The commission's historian was no less than Doris Kearns Goodwin, who looked at the entire scope of this problem in American history and what the role of Congress and the President should be. And the commission issued a unanimous report proposing an act to replace the War Powers Act of 1973, briefed Congress and the incoming President Obama on the particular act in 2007 and 2008. But at that time, the time wasn't yet ripe for consideration of this bill. But now that we're 40 years into an unworkable War Powers Resolution, and now, as the senator indicated, we've had a string of presidents, both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, who've maintained that the act is unconstitutional. And now that we've had a 40-year history of Congress often acceding to the claim of unconstitutionality by not following the War Powers Resolution itself, we do think it is time to revisit. Let me just state two fundamental substantive issues that this bill presents in the War Powers Consultation Act of 2014. First, there's a set of definitions. What is war? Well, the bill defines significant military action as any action where involvement of U.S. troops would be expected to be in combat for at least a week or longer. And under those circumstances, the provisions of the Act would be triggered. There are some exceptions in the Act. The Act would not cover defined covert action operations. But once a combat operation was expected to last for more than 7 days, the Act would be triggered. The Act basically sets up two important substantive improvements on the War Powers Resolution. First, a permanent consultation committee is established of Congress with the majority and minority leaders of both houses and the chairs and ranking members of the four key committees in both houses that deal with war issues: Intel, Armed Services, Foreign Relations, and Appropriations. That permanent consultation committee is a venue for discussion between the executive and legislative branches, permanent and continuous, over matters in the world that may require the use of American military force. Because the question comes up often, well, what did the President do to consult with Congress? Is it enough to call a few leaders or call a few committee chairs? This act would normalize and regularize what consultation with Congress means by establishing a permanent consultation committee and requiring ongoing dialogue between the executive and that committee. The second requirement of this bill is that once military action is commenced that would take more than 7 days, there is a requirement for a vote in both houses of Congress. The consultation committee itself would put a resolution on the table in both houses to approve or disapprove of military action. It would be a privileged motion with expedited requirements for debate, amendment, and vote. And that would ensure that we do not reach a situation where action is being taken at the instance of one branch with the other branch not in agreement. Because to do that would put our men and women who are fighting and in harm's way at the risk of sacrificing their lives when we in the political leadership have not done the job of reaching a consensus behind the mission. To conclude, I'll acknowledge what the senator from Arizona said. This is a very, very thorny and difficult question that has created challenges and differences of interpretation since the Constitution was written in 1787. Despite the fact that the framers who wrote the Constitution actually had a pretty clear idea about how it should operate, it's never really operated that way. 40 years of a failed war powers resolution in today's dangerous world suggests that it's time now to get back in and to do some careful deliberation to update and normalize the appropriate level of consultation between a president and the legislature. And the recent events, as cited by the senator, whatever you think about the merits or the equities, whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria, whether it's the discussions we're having now with respect to Iran or any other of a number of potential spots around the world that could lead to conflict, suggests that while decisions about war and initiation of military action will never be easy, they get harder if we don't have an agreed-upon process for coming to understand each other's points of view and then acting in the best interest of the nation to forge a consensus. And so with that, Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to stand with my colleague after a number of months of discussion and introduce this bill, and I look forward to the opportunity to carry this dialogue forward with my colleagues in this body. Thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that privileges of the floor be granted to the following member of my staff, and that is Laura Markstein.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to talk about the omnibus for a brief time before Senator Leahy has some remarks to be made. First of all, I think it's important, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee and their staffs for their hard work to draft a sensible funding bill that I think really meets the needs of the American people. A bill that helps us move past the stalemate and disagreements of the past few years and do what the American people sent us here to do, and that is roll up our sleeves, work together, work hard, and govern. Recently, folks have put politics and partisanship ahead of our constituents and our responsibilities, and the results haven't been pretty. But thanks to Chairman Mikulski and Ranking Member Shelby and their counterparts in the House of Representatives, we now have a responsible bipartisan bill that we can work with. One that invests in our future to strengthen our economy, but that makes tough choices so that we can continue to get our fiscal house in order. Approving this bill helps us avoid another round of devastating sequester cuts, avoid a government shutdown, and avoid some of the bitterness that is dragging down economic growth. In Montana, our seniors, our children, women, and civilian members of the military, to name a few, felt the sequesters cuts head on. Kids couldn't go to Head Start, the elderly couldn't get meals, women faced cuts to reproductive health programs, Defense Department employees were forced to stay home, and our military was dangerously close to being hollowed out. This bill makes smart choices to continue to reduce our deficit while investing in core national priorities, those being education, health care, infrastructure, research and development, and defense. And at the same time, it continues our fiscally responsible approach to governing by reducing or eliminating funding for dozens of programs that have been left on autopilot after 2 years of continuing resolutions. And it repeals the recently enacted reduction in the annual cost of living adjustments for disabled military retirees and for survivors of military retirees. This particular change is very important for folks who have been medically retired and for survivors, the folks who are more likely to be on a fixed income. And it was done without any fanfare and without any grandstanding. Senator Mikulski and Senator Shelby figured out how to fix it. Now let's be clear. This is one step in a two-step process. We have more work to do to address the military pension issue to make sure that it works for the men and women of our military who have made great sacrifices on our behalf. I also want to thank Chairman Reid and Senator Murkowski for putting forward a smart interior bill. By ending sequestration, we're able to make some real progress in Indian country and in protecting some of America's most unique landscapes. The interior bill increases funding for Indian Health Service, which is necessary. It increases funding for Indian education and for promoting good stewardship of our public lands. This interior bill is critically important to states like Montana and it will improve the quality of life for folks on our 7 reservations, and it will create more tourism and recreational opportunities throughout Montana. I am concerned, however, by the absence of one measure. It's a measure approved by the Senate Appropriations and Rules Committee. It is bipartisan. It saves money. It brings more transparency and accountability to a town that needs more of both. And more than 1/3 of the Senate is a co-sponsor. This act is called the Senate Campaign Disclosure Parity Act. Right now, candidates for the Senate do not have to electronically file their campaign finance reports with the Federal Elections Commission. Now, they can voluntarily e-file, and maybe you did, Mr. President, but many of our colleagues do not. Instead, all a Senate candidate has to do is take a big stack of documents, drop them on the door of the Secretary of the Senate's office, and head back to the campaign trail. Then what happens? The Secretary of the Senate then sends the documents to the FEC, which spends time and money hiring contractors to put these reports online where they can be viewed by the public. This costs taxpayers nearly $500,000, and God knows how many staff hours each year to make this information available. But the biggest cost is to the American people, particularly to our voters, who have the right to know who is funding the campaigns of their elected officials. It's not as if I'm proposing a new idea, Mr. President. Candidates for the House of Representatives must electronically file their finance reports. Presidential candidates e-file. Yet the Senate is stuck in the dark ages. In an era of smartphones and cars that drive themselves and combines that harvest fields using GPS, today the Senate is dropping stacks of paper at officials' doorsteps. I proudly voluntarily e-file my campaign finance reports. I know that many of our colleagues do as well, but that's not enough. Ironically, we don't know why my bill to improve transparency and save money didn't make it into the funding bill. I'm told it was blocked by the House of Representatives. Now, a few folks over at the House are pointing fingers back over here. That's finger pointing instead of accountability, politics instead of governance. We can do better. Here in the U.S. Congress, we consistently demand more transparency from federal agency, and that's the right thing to do. But we need to also look in the mirror. We're not doing what we demand of others. But Americans are demanding this funding bill as well. It's a step forward to responsible government. It makes tough choices to getting our fiscal house in order while investing in the future. This omnibus is a good bill. It puts our country on more solid footing. It delivers more certainty to small businesses so that we can count on them to grow and create jobs. Our constituents sent us here to find common ground. This kind of responsible bill is why we're here. So once again, I want to thank the Chairwoman and the Ranking Member for their hard work in bringing this bill to the floor. I look forward to seeing its final passage. With that, I yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. I want to address my remarks first to the Chairman and the Ranking Member of the Appropriations Committee. I think you've done a lot of hard work, and you've done something that, even though I'm not in the consensus, you've done what the Senate was designed to do, is build a consensus around a bill. And there's no question this bill will pass today, and so my congratulations to you and my sincere thanks for some of the things that you put in the bill that we've been working on that are good government projects. So I just wanted to say that from the start. And I'm not going to talk specifically about the bill. I'm going to talk in bigger, broader terms of the problems that are facing us as a country. I have in my hands a book that contains $9 trillion worth of cuts. Not hardly anybody in the Senate read it. They may not agree with 50 or 60 or 70%. But there's certainly somewhere in here consensus for us to actually save a whole lot more money than what we're doing. In 2009, a young little lady by the name of Madeline showed up outside the Senate. And this is what she had draped around her. I'm already $38,375 in debt, and I only own a dollhouse. And since that period of time, we've managed to markedly change that situation for her to the worse. Because today, if she was outside, she'd have that sign around her neck, and it'd say $54,602, and she only owns a dollhouse. And the point I'm trying to make is this hole's getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And although I didn't vote for the budget agreement because I think it could have been done better, it was an agreement. It had a consensus as well. So my criticism isn't that the members of this body forced a consensus, which is exactly what the Senate's supposed to do. But I think as we've done these things, we might have lost sight of the big picture. And so I want to share with you for a minute what the big picture really looks like, because it is not pretty. According to generally accepted accounting principles, that's not the way we run the government, by the way. We don't use real accounting principles. We use all the tricks and smokes and mirrors we can. This number is indisputable. The unfunded liabilities for the federal government are $127 trillion. Think about that. We can't even imagine how much that is. Our national debt is $17.33 trillion as of last night. I checked it. There's 114 million households in America. If you take the federal liability per household, it comes out to $1.11 million. So $1,110,000 is what the debt plus the liability is for every family in this country. And it's growing. And I know we can't solve this problem over 1 year or 2 years. I'm so thankful the senator who is leading up the Appropriation Committee is in her position. I have the most wonderful respect for her. She's a listener. She wants to do right. But what we have to do is change the direction of this. It needs to go the other way. And that requires everybody. If you think about it, if the average family per capita income, which is what it was last year in this country, $53,000, can you imagine how we're going to leverage and afford just the interest costs on $1,110,000? If you had 5% on $1 million, that's $55,000. That's more. Just the interest costs are more than the median family income in this country. So there are parts of this bill that are in front of us that I'm highly critical of. I don't like the fact that we play game with chimps, changes in mandatory programs. To me, it's not straightforward to the American people. It's not being honest about what we're actually doing. But what we're actually doing is digging the hole deeper. And let me just outline some things we could have done that we didn't do before we had the budget agreement and before we had this appropriation bill. The GAO over the last 3 years has identified about $250 billion that we could take a large portion of away just by eliminating duplication and by putting metrics on programs. Now think about that. That's $250 billion a year. So if we were to do that, and I've been out here and given speeches on all this and what everything's duplicative of, but the problem is the appropriate committees have not met to look at the GAO recommendations. They've not acted on them. They've not responded to them. The administration, and I'll give them credit, in their budgets the last few years, they've looked at those GAOs and made recommendations in their budgets for eliminations and consolidations. But we've essentially ignored it. And I know how tough it is to build a consensus in the Appropriations Committee that will get you the votes that you need to accomplish that. from the parochial concerns to the total budget concerns. I understand that. I'm glad we got a number now, and I'm glad you brought a bill that has a number. I think the number's too high if we're going to ever do anything about this. But the fact that we don't do anything that will really make a difference in the future in terms of driving this number down. Just think, if we, let's say the GAO's 50% right. Let's just say they're only 50% right. What if we consolidated, put metrics on programs and streamlined them as they recommend, and we saved $150 billion a year? That starts going in the right direction. It changes us. We start going in the right direction. Now think for a minute that if we have no recessions over the next 20 years and we have great economic growth at 4%, we still don't solve this problem because the interest costs are greater than the GDP growth associated with our country. So I wanted to give the background of why I come out here all the time and raise the issue of why we're stealing the future from our children. And nobody can deny the fact that we haven't done the work. The reasons that we haven't done the work are multiple, but most of it is we just won't do the work. And we don't have the leadership that requires us to do the work. Think about Madeline. Let's say she gets a great college education and is in the upper quintile in our country in terms of her earnings when she's 25. With normalized interest rates, she's going to fall behind. So I know we're talking out in the future, but one of the things Thomas Jefferson wanted out of the Senate was for us to be long-range thinkers. Not to think about the problem right now. Think about what the problem is going to be. And in my 9 years here, I have failed in my ability to convince my colleagues that we ought to be worried about this problem. Because the promise of America was opportunity. The promise of the poorhouse is no opportunity. And what we have set up for the average American family in the future is the poorhouse. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can fight among priorities, but the one thing we shouldn't be fighting about, the one thing that we should know that we can fix is, why would there be 679 different renewable energy programs? Can anybody give any possible justification for that? You know, it's just $15 billion a year, but if you consolidated them down to 20, you could save $5 billion a year. That's $50 billion over 10 years. Or why are there 253 different Department of Justice crime prevention grants? Each one of them has an overhead. And what we found when we studied it is people get a grant from one and then use the same grant application to go to another grant overhead in DOJ, get the grant from another section, another program, for exactly the same claim. And the right hand doesn't know the left hand. If you consolidate them, one, you'd get more money to each individual grant, and number two is you wouldn't have the duplication, the fraud, and the lack of compliance that we know that these grant programs are loaded with. We've done the work. We've done the oversight. We've actually gone and studied them. Or why are there 209, think about this, science, technology, engineering, and math incentive programs, education programs, 13 different agencies, $3.5 billion a year. Why do we allow that to happen? Why do we allow? Here's the real face of who it's going to affect. And yet we won't do the hard work. And it's not the appropriator's job to do that work. I understand that. But one of the things that appropriators could do is saying we're not going to fund any of these programs unless you consolidate them and put metrics on them. So if you expect it to come out in March, and I'm so happy that the chairman wants to run the appropriation bills to get back to normal, but to say, Judiciary Committee, if you want these justice grant programs run, consolidate them, put metrics on them, streamline them, and send them to us, and then we'll fund them. If you don't, so everybody will know, we're appropriating a year about $480 billion worth of money for programs that aren't authorized at all. So one of the strengths of the Appropriation Committee could be that you could put some demands on the Authorizing Committee to clean this stuff up. Let me just give you a couple more. Healthcare has been in the news. How many of us realize that we have 91 different healthcare training programs spending $14 billion a year? None of my colleagues probably know that. But in the Committee of Jurisdiction, they've done nothing about it. And so I don't object to spending $14 billion on health training programs or any of these other things, as long as we're doing it wisely. And what I would suggest to you, 91 different programs, which should be probably 4 or 5, and the overhead associated with the others is saved to the American public, that we could save a significant amount of money for Madeline. Because the real story is our excesses, our lack of work, our lack of consolidation, our lack of streamlining, our lack of elimination, duplication, our lack of demanding metrics so that we know that the programs that we're out there funding are working. We're not going to pay the price for it. Nobody in this room. The people who are going to be paying the price for it is Madeline's generation. And how are they going to pay for that price? What's going to happen? What's the real cost associated with that? It's not a pretty picture. Here's what it is. It's a markedly declining standard of living. Most people don't know that median family incomes in real dollars in America today is at the exact same level it was in 1989. And it's going backwards. Even with a growing economy. It's going backwards. So the assets available to a family are declining while the obligations for that family are increasing. And we're responsible for that. And it's not something that we can't fix, it's something that we choose not to fix. I also would say that I have one large concern in this bill. We increased NIH back up $1 billion. We're still not where we were 2 years ago. But we started with $800 million more at the Defense Department, duplicating programs that are already running at the NIH. So you're making my list bigger, not smaller. We're going in the wrong direction. We have great people at the NIH. We've got a great leader in Francis Collins. They've markedly improved their management of their grants, their oversight of their grants. And we're going to take $800 million and move it over to another set of overhead with people not nearly as experienced, not nearly as knowledgeable. And we're going to be spending money in the Defense Department to study things that we're spending money, the exact same type of thing, at NIH. So we're not going to get great value for this money. What we're going to do is waste it. And what that $800 million should have done is should have gone to NIH. And every other non-military related medical program over there, that money should have gone to NIH. And when you talk to the senators that started this, both Tom Harkin and our former colleague, now deceased, Ted Stevens, they'll admit to you in private that it was a mistake to ever start it this way. because we're wasting a ton of precious dollars that could be used to save somebody's life. But somebody has a reason for that. I don't know what it is. But I'll tell you, in this bill, you got $68 billion of appropriations for the Defense Department that have nothing to do with the defense of this country. Now, you don't get all those savings if you take it out of the Defense Department, but you get $3 or $4 billion if you take it out of the Defense Department. And that $3 or $4 billion could fund NIH back at a level that it should be funded, or could protect Madeline from further decline in her standard of living. So I've made my point. I understand my perspective is not in the majority. But I'll guarantee you my perspective is in the majority of Americans. That we ought not to have 679 renewable energy initiatives. I don't think you'd find anybody in the country who would disagree with me on that. That they ought to be consolidated. They ought to be run efficiently. They ought to have metrics on them. And as well as the other hundreds of sets of duplications. We're going to get another report next month from the GAO, actually in March. It'll be their fourth. And they're so discouraged because they do all this hard work and they make recommendations and then we sit on them. We don't act. And so if I were to have a challenge to my colleagues, is first of all, read the reports over the last 4 years and look at the data that shows where we're really wasting money. And then, please, for Madeline and her generation's sake, act on it. Don't ignore it. I know it's not easy work. It's hard work. I've done oversight for 9 years here. But it can be done. It should be done. And the Madelines of America are worth it. I yield the floor.
Madam President.